Hello, creeps. I told you I had something special in store for you, and Doc is a man of his word. Doc is a fiercely loyal man of his word. So, if you didn't infer already, this little surprise I have for you has to do with Halloween, the season of the witch. What I'm going to be giving to you every week is going to be a couple of little spooky stories. And today I thought, what better way to kick us off than something that's so infamous and also has a little brevity to it. So, we can just dip our feet in rather than jumping in all the way. What I'm going to do is I'm going to read you a couple stories from Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to read one bit from each section from the book. If you're not familiar, the contents are, part one is, ah! And those are stories to scare your friends and make them go, ah! Second part is, he heard footsteps coming up the cellar stairs. Third is, they eat your eyes, they eat your nose. Fourth one is danger. And the fifth one comes back to, ah! Alright, so let's get started to story number one from, ah! And the name of the story is, What Do You Come For? There was an old woman who lived all by herself, and she was very lonely. Sitting in the kitchen one night, she said, "Oh, I wish I had some company." No sooner had she spoken than down the chimney tumbled 2 feet from which the flesh had rotted. The old woman's eyes bulged with terror. Then 2 legs dropped to the hearth and attached themselves to the feet. Then a body tumbled down. Then 2 arms and a man's head. As the old woman watched, the parts came together into a great gangling man. The man danced around and around the room. Faster and faster he went. Then he stopped and he looked into her eyes. "What do you come for?" she asked in a small voice that shivered and shook. "What do I come for?" he said. "I come for you!" Alright, that was What Do You Come For? Now, here's number 2 from part 2, entitled The White Wolf. The timber wolves around French Creek had gotten out of hand. There were so many wolves, the farmers could not stop them from killing their cattle and sheep. So, the state put a bounty on them. It would pay a hunter $10 for every wolf pelt he turned in. A butcher in town named Bill Williams thought that was pretty good money. He stopped working as a butcher and started killing wolves. He was good at it. Every year he killed over 500 of them. That came to more than $5,000. It was quite a bit of money in those days. After 4 or 5 years, Bill had killed so many wolves, there were hardly any left in that area. So he retired, and he vowed never to harm another wolf because wolves had made him rich. Then one day, a farmer reported that a white wolf had killed 2 of his sheep. He had shot at it and hit it, but the bullets didn't have any effect. Soon that wolf was seen all over the countryside, killing and running, but nobody could stop it. One night, it came into Bill's yard and killed his pet cow. Bill forgot about his decision never to harm another wolf. He went into town the next morning and bought a young lamb for bait. He took it out into the hills and tied it to a tree. Then he backed off about 50 yards and sat down under another tree. Without his gun in his lap, he waited. When Bill didn't come back, his friends started looking for him. Finally, they found the lamb. It was still tied to a tree. It was hungry, but it was alive. Then they found Bill. He was still sitting against the other tree, but he was dead. His throat had been torn open. But there was no sign of a struggle. His gun hadn't been fired, and there were no tracks in the soil around him. As for the white wolf, it was never seen again. Alright, now the installment for part 3, entitled The Girl Who Stood on a Grave. Some boys and girls were at a party one night. There was a graveyard down the street, and they were talking about how scary it was. "Don't ever stand on a grave after dark," one of the boys said. "The person inside will grab you. He'll pull you under." "That's not true," one of the girls said. "It's just a superstition." "I'll give you $1 if you stand on a grave," said the boy. "A grave doesn't scare me." said the girl. "I'll do it right now." The boy handed her his knife. "Stick the knife in one of the graves," he said. "Then we'll know you were there." The graveyard was filled with shadows. It was as quiet as death. "There is nothing to be scared of," the girl told herself, but she was scared anyway. She picked out a grave and stood on it. Then quickly she bent over and plunged the knife into the soil. And she started to leave, but she couldn't get away. Something was holding her back. She tried a second time to leave, but she couldn't move. She was filled with terror. "Something has got me!" she screamed, and she fell to the ground. When she didn't come back, the others went to look for her. They found her body sprawled across the grave. Without realizing it, she had plunged the knife through her skirt and had pinned it to the ground. It was only the knife that held her. She had died of fright. Now, the next installment from part 4 is honestly one of my favorites out of all of these ever, entitled The Hook. Donald and Sarah went to the movies. Then they went for a ride in Donald's car. They parked up on a hill at the edge of town. From there they could see the lights up and down the valley. Donald turned on the radio and found some music, but an announcer had broken with a news bulletin. A murderer had escaped from the state prison. He was armed with a knife and was headed south on foot. He was armed with a knife, and his left hand was missing. In its place, he wore a hook. "Let's roll up the windows and lock the doors," said Sarah. "That's a good idea," said Donald. "That prison isn't too far away," said Sarah. "Maybe we really should go home." "But it's only 10 o'clock, said Donald. "I don't care what time it is," she said. "I want to go home." "Look, Sarah," said Donald. "He's not going to climb all the way up here. Why would he do that? Even if he did, all the doors are locked. How could he get in?" "Donald, he could take that hook and break through a window and open a door," she said. "I'm scared. I want to go home." Donald was annoyed. "Girls are always afraid of something," he said. As he started the car, Sarah thought she heard someone or something scratching at her door. "Did you hear that?" she asked as they roared away. "It sounded like someone was trying to get in." "Oh, sure," said Donald. Soon they got to her house. "Would you like to come in and have some cocoa?" she asked. "No," he said. "I've got to go home." He went around to the other side of the car to let her out. Hanging on the door handle was a hook. Alright, and back again we are to... Ah! More stories to make you go... Ah! And this one is yet another one of my faves. This one's called The Ghost with the Bloody Fingers. A businessman arrived at a hotel late one night and asked for a room. The room clerk told him the hotel was all filled up. "There's only one empty room," he said. "But we don't rent that one because it's haunted." "I'll take it," said the businessman. "I don't believe in ghosts." The man went up to the room. He unpacked his things and he went to bed. As soon as he did, a ghost came out of the closet. Its fingers were bleeding and it was moaning, "Bloody fingers! Bloody fingers!" When the man saw the ghost, he grabbed his things and ran. The next night, a woman arrived very late. Again, all the rooms were taken except the haunted room. "I'll sleep there," she said. "I'm not afraid of ghosts." As soon as she got into bed, the ghost came out of the closet. Its fingers were still bleeding. It still was moaning, "Bloody fingers! Bloody fingers!" And the woman took one look and ran. A week later, another guest arrived very late. He also took the haunted room. After he unpacked, he got out his guitar and he began to play. Soon the ghost appeared. As before, its fingers were bleeding and it was moaning, "Bloody fingers! Bloody fingers!" The man paid no attention. He just kept strumming his guitar, but the ghost kept moaning and its fingers kept bleeding. Finally, the guitar player looked up. "Cool it, man," he said. "Get yourself a Band-Aid." Alright, well, that's all I got for my spooky extra for you this week. Just wait until Friday. I got something extra spooky for you. Hope you enjoyed this, creeps. Until then, See you Friday, see you Monday, see you Tuesday. Love you, creeps. Doc out. Hello, creeps. Back again for some more scary stories to tell in the dark. So, hopefully you're in the dark, dim down the lights, and let's get this thing going. I'm going to be doing today some stories from part 2 of Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. And I think it's safe to say that I'm going to probably be doing a part 3. So how about you start leaving some comments on these videos, tell me your favorite stories so I can make a compilation in the end, because it seems like you guys are getting a kick out of these like I am. So let's get into this. First one is entitled, A Weird Blue Light. Late one night in October 1864, a Confederate blockade runner slipped by some Union gunboats at the entrance to Galveston Bay in Texas and made it safely to port with its cargo of food and other necessities. Lewis Billings, the master of the small vessel, was getting ready to weigh anchor when he was startled by a shriek from one of the crew. A strange old-fashioned schooner with a big black flag was rushing down at us, Billings said later. She was afire with a sort of weird pale blue light that lighted up every nook and cranny of her. The crew was pulling at the ropes and doing other work, and they paid us no attention. Didn't even glance our way. They all had ghastly bleeding wounds, but their faces and eyes were those of dead men. The man who had shrieked had fallen to his knees, his teeth chattering as he gasped out a prayer. Overcoming my own terror, that was chilling the very marrow of my bones, I rushed forward, shouting to the others as I ran. Suddenly, the schooner vanished before my eyes. Some say that it was the ghost of John Lafitte's pirate ship, Pride, that sank off Galveston Island in 1821 or 1822. She was seen again in 1892 in the same waters, with the same crew. The Bride. The minister's daughter had just gotten married. After the wedding ceremony, there was a great feast, with music and dancing and contests and games, even old children's games. Why, they got to playing hide and seek. The bride decided to hide in her grandfather's trunk up in the attic. "They'll never find me there," she thought. As she was climbing into the trunk, the lid came down and cracked her on the head, and she fell unconscious inside. The lid slammed shut and locked. No one will ever know how long she called for help, or how hard she struggled to free herself from that tomb. Everyone in the village searched for her, and they looked almost everywhere, but no one thought of looking in the trunk. After a week, her brand-new bridegroom and all the others gave her up for lost. Years later, a maid went up into the attic looking for something she needed. "Maybe it is in the trunk," she thought. She opened it and screamed. There lay the missing bride in her wedding dress, but by then, she was only a skeleton. Rings on her fingers. Daisy Clark had been in a coma for more than a month when the doctor said that she had finally died. She was buried on a cool summer day in a small cemetery about a mile from her home. "May she always rest in such peace," her husband said, but she didn't. Late that night, a grave robber with a shovel and a lantern began to dig her up. Since the ground was still soft, he quickly reached the coffin and got it open. His hunch was right. Daisy had been buried wearing 2 valuable rings, a wedding ring with a diamond in it, and a ring with a ruby that glowed as if it were alive. The thief got down on his knees and reached into the coffin to get the rings, but they were stuck fast on her fingers. So he decided that the only way to get them was to cut off her fingers with a knife. But when he cut into the finger with the wedding ring, it began to bleed, and Daisy Clark began to stir. Suddenly, she sat up. Terrified, the thief scrambled to his feet. He accidentally kicked over the lantern, and the light went out. He could hear Daisy climb out of her grave. As she moved past him in the dark, he stood there, frozen with fear, clutching the knife in his hand. When Daisy saw him, she pulled her shroud around her and asked, "Who are you?" When the grave robber heard this corpse speak, he ran. Daisy shrugged her shoulders and walked on, and never once looked back. But in his fear and confusion, the thief fled in the wrong direction. He pitched headlong into her grave, fell on the knife, and stabbed himself. While Daisy walked home, the thief bled to death. Wonderful Sausage. One dark, rainy Saturday afternoon, a fat and jolly butcher named Samuel Blunt had an argument over money with his wife, Eloise. Blunt lost his temper and killed Eloise. Then he ground her up into sausage meat and buried her bones under a big flat rock in the backyard. To keep the murder a secret, he told everyone that she had moved away. Blunt mixed his new sausage meat with pork, then seasoned it with salt and pepper, adding some sage and thyme and a bit of garlic to give it a special flavor. He smoked it in his smokehouse for a while. He called it Blunt's Special Sausage. There was such a demand for this new sausage that Blunt bought the best hogs he could find and started raising his own pork. He also kept a sharp lookout for humans who might make a tasty sausage meat. One day, a nice, plump school teacher came into his shop. Blunt grabbed her and ground her up. Another time, Blunt's dentist came by. He was a little round man, and into the grinder he went. Then, one by one, the children in the neighborhood began to disappear, and so did their kittens and puppies. But no one ever dreamed that Blunt the butcher had anything to do with it. Things went on that way for years. Then, one day, Blunt made a big mistake. A fat boy came into the butcher shop. Blunt grabbed him and started to drag him off to the sausage grinder. But the boy broke loose and ran out of the shop, and Blunt chased after him waving the big butcher knife. When people saw this, they realized at once what had become of all the missing children and grown-ups and kittens and puppies. An angry crowd gathered at the butcher shop. No one knows for sure just what happened to Blunt that day. Some say he was fed to his hogs. Others say he was fed to his sausage grinder. But he was never seen again, and neither was his wonderful sausage meat. The Man in the Middle. It was almost midnight. Sally Truitt had just gotten on the subway train at 15th Street after visiting her mother. "Don't worry," Sally had told her. "The subway is safe. There's always a policeman on duty." But that night she didn't see one. Except for her, the subway car was empty. At 42nd Street, 3 tough-looking men got on. 2 of them were holding up the third, who looked drunk. His head rolled from side to side and his legs refused to work. When they got him seated between them, his head came to rest on one of his shoulders. Sally thought he was staring at her. She buried her head in a book and tried not to notice. At 28th Street, one of the men stood up. "Take it easy, Jim," he said to the man in the middle, and he got off. At 23rd Street, Jim's other friend stood up. "You'll be fine," he said, and he got off. Now the only ones left in the car were Jim and Sally. Just then the train went around a sharp curve and Jim pitched onto the floor at Sally's feet. When she looked down at him, she saw a trickle of blood on one side of his head, and just above it, a bullet hole. The Dead Man's Hand. The students at the school for nurses got along quite well with one another, except for Alice. The trouble with Alice was that she was perfect. At least that's how it seemed to the other students. She was always friendly and always cheerful. Nothing ever upset her. Her school assignments were always on time and always perfect. She didn't even bite her fingernails. Many of the student nurses resented Alice. They would have liked to see her fail at something, become frightened or cry, or do something that showed she had weakness like they did. One night, several students tried to frighten Alice with a practical joke. They buried the hand of a corpse they had been studying in anatomy and tied it to the light cord in her closet. When she tried to turn on the light, she would find herself holding a dead man's hand. "That would scare anybody," one of them said. "If it doesn't scare her, nothing will." After tying the hand in place, they went to the movies. When they got back, Alice was asleep. But when they didn't see her the next morning, they decided to find out what had happened. There was no sign of Alice in her room, but they soon found her. She was sitting on the floor in her closet, staring at the dead man's hand and mumbling to herself. Alice didn't even look up. The joke had worked, but nobody was laughing. Alright, and our last offering for today, creeps, is going to be sounds. The house was near the beach. It was a big old place where nobody had lived for years. From time to time, somebody would force open a window or a door and spend the night there, but never longer. 3 fishermen caught in a storm took shelter there one night. With some dry wood they found inside, they made a fire in the fireplace. They lay down on the floor and tried to get some sleep, but none of them slept that night. First, they heard footsteps upstairs. It sounded like there were several people moving back and forth. When one of the fishermen called, "Who's up there?" the footsteps stopped. Then they heard a woman scream. The scream turned into a groan and died away. Blood began to drip from the ceiling into the room where the fishermen huddled. A small red pool formed on the floor and soaked into the wood. A door upstairs crashed shut, and again the woman screamed, "Not me!" She cried. It sounded as if she was running, her high heels tapping wildly down the hall. "I'll get you!" a man shouted, and the floor shook as he chased her. Then silence. There wasn't a sound until the man who had shouted began to laugh. Long peals of horrible laughter filled the house. It went on until the fishermen thought they would go mad. When it finally stopped, the fishermen heard someone coming down the stairs, dragging something heavy that bumped on each step. They heard him drag it through the front hall and out the front door. The door opened, then slammed shut. Again, silence. Suddenly, a flash of lightning filled the house with a green blaze of light. A ghastly face stared at the fishermen from the hallway. Then came a crash of thunder. Terrified, they ran out into the storm. Can you hear me? Good. Welcome back for some more scary stories to tell in the dark, creeps. I am Doc Fugit, and, well, let's just get right into the nitty-gritty. First story I'm going to be reading today is The Viper. There was a man who inherited a house when his uncle died. The house sat on a hill outside of town, and rumor had it that the place was haunted. The man decided to move in straight away despite his reservations. But late that night, the phone rang, and when he answered it, a creepy voice said,
"I am the Viper. I will be there in 2 hours.
And then hung up before he could say anything. Not long afterwards, the phone rang again, and the same creepy voice said,
"I am the Viper. I will be there in 20 minutes.
and hung up. This made the man quite nervous, and he began to wonder who this mysterious caller could be. Before he knew it, the phone was ringing again.
"I am the Viper. I will be there in 10 minutes.
The man was getting more concerned now. A few minutes later, the phone rang.
"I am the Viper. I will be there in 5 minutes.
Needless to say, the man began to panic. Again, the phone rang, and the man slowly lifted the receiver and put it to his ear.
"I am the Viper. I will be there in 1 minute.
Said the voice. The man ran around locking all the windows and doors, and then called the police. They told him that officers were on their way. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. Shaking with fear, the man opened the door a crack and asked, "Is that the police?"
"No,"
replied the voice.
"I am the Viper. I come every night to wash and wipe your windows. Where should I start?"
Next tale is The Thing. There were 2 young boys named Trevor and Will. They spent most of their summer vacation hanging around town looking for things to do. One hot August night, the boys were sitting on a fence by the main road. There was a cornfield just across the road. Suddenly, Trevor spotted something in the field. In the darkness, it was difficult to make out, but he thought it looked like some kind of weird animal. He nudged his friend and pointed in the direction of the strange-looking figure. Will said he could see it too. He wasn't sure, but the mysterious thing seemed vaguely human. The next thing they knew, the thing was gone. The boys craned their necks and scanned the field with their eyes. Out of the blackness came the thing. It slowly walked over to the edge of the field before disappearing again. Trevor and Will looked at each other, puzzled. "What was that?" asked Will. "I have no idea," replied Trevor. No sooner had he said that than Trevor felt a clammy hand on his shoulder. He turned around and found himself staring directly into the hideous face of the thing. He let out a yell of terror and surprise.
The rotting skin on the thing's face was coming off in places, revealing the bone underneath. For a moment it just stared silently at Trevor with its dark, sunken eyes. Then it suddenly grabbed hold of his arm. Trevor felt his fingernails dig into his flesh as he wriggled out of its grasp. The two boys leapt off the fence and ran down the road screaming in horror. They didn't stop running until they reached their homes. They tried to tell their parents and friends about the thing they had seen that night, but nobody believed them. When Trevor woke up the next morning, the scratches on his arms were still there. After a few days, they got worse and worse. Trevor got sick and his parents took him to see a doctor. After examining his arm, the doctor told the boy it was infected and gave him some pills to take. Unfortunately, Trevor's condition got worse and worse. The infection spread to his entire arm, and it wasn't long before his flesh was rotting and falling off. He was taken to the hospital, but no matter what the doctors did, no treatment seemed to work. The infection spread throughout his whole body. Trevor was confined to bed and started to waste away. It seemed like he was beyond help, and as the days went by, he steadily grew worse and worse. His anguished parents could only sit at his bedside and cry as they watched their beloved son slowly rotting away before their eyes. On the day that Trevor finally passed away, Will came to the hospital to visit him. When the boy walked into the hospital room and saw Trevor lying in bed, he was horrified. His friend looked exactly like the thing.
And the next one goes out to all you creeps who work in corporate, well, not America, but the corporate world. This one is called Room for One More. There was a young woman who had just started a new job in a large office building. She was walking to work one day when a long black hearse drove up slowly next to her, matching her pace. This made her nervous, and she anxiously watched it out of the corner of her eye. The driver leaned out the window and called to her in a deep, booming voice. "Do you need a lift?" She turned to look at him and got a terrible shock. The driver's face was incredibly hideous and deformed. His skin was a deathly pale, and one of his eyes was noticeably higher than the other. The man pointed to the rear of the vehicle, which contained a coffin. "Room for one more," he said. Frightened by his bizarre appearance and unwelcome suggestion, she refused his offer of a lift. Profoundly disturbed, the woman ran down the street until she came to the office building where she worked. For the rest of the day, she couldn't stop thinking about the strange man in the hearse, and was glad when work was finally over. The woman worked up on the north floor, and when the elevator came, it was almost completely full. She hesitated a moment before stepping in. "Are you sure you don't want to come in?" asked a familiar, booming voice. "There's room for one more." The woman gasped. It was the hearse driver from the morning, eyeing her with his lopsided, horrible gaze. Now thoroughly spooked, the woman backed away, stuttering, I think I'll take the stairs." The hearse driver just stared at her as the doors slid closed. The woman had only taken a few steps down the stairs when she heard a chorus of screams followed by a deafening crash. She hurried downstairs and discovered the elevator cable had broken, and all the passengers aboard had plunged to a grisly death. Alright, this one's going to be the last one for today. It is called Babysitter. And if you're interested in this one, maybe you should go check out our original story, Murder on the Marsh. We got it up on here on our YouTube channel. Just some food for thought. Let's get into it. There was a young girl who was in need of a job and was able to find work as a babysitter for a couple who lived in a large, isolated old house. They were going out to see a movie that night and left the teenage babysitter in charge of their 3 young children. The babysitter put the children to bed when it got late and then went downstairs to watch some television. She was just getting comfortable when she heard the phone ringing. When she answered it, all she heard was heavy breathing, followed by a man's voice asking, "Have you checked on the children?" Freaked out, she hung up the phone, trying to convince herself that it was just someone playing a practical joke on her. She went back to watching television, but about 15 minutes later, the phone rang again. She picked up the receiver and heard hysterical laughter from the other end of the line. Then the same voice asked, "Why haven't you checked on the children?" The babysitter slammed down the phone. The poor girl was frightened out of her wits and immediately called the police. The operator at the police station told the babysitter that if the man called again, she should try to keep him talking.
That would give the police time to trace the call. A few minutes later, the phone rang a third time, and when the babysitter answered it, she heard the heavy breathing again. The voice on the line said,
"You should really check on the children."
The babysitter listened on him, laughing hysterically for a long time. She hung up the phone again, and almost immediately it rang. This time, it was the operator from the police station who yelled, "Get out of the house! Right now! The calls are coming from the upstairs phone!" The babysitter dropped the phone in shock, and suddenly she heard heavy footsteps walking down the stairs. Without pausing for a second, she ran out of the house as fast as her legs could carry her. Just as she closed the front door behind her, a man's hand slammed against the glass. She screamed and ran out into the street just as a police car was pulling up outside. The police searched the house and found the 2 children upstairs, hiding in a closet, crying uncontrollably. In the parents' bedroom, they found a bloody axe lying on the floor next to the upstairs phone. The back window was open wide, and the curtains were blowing in the breeze. There was no sign of the madman who had made the phone calls. He had escaped into the night when the policemen arrived, and managed to interrupt his horrible plan to kill the 2 children and the poor babysitter. Alright, creeps, well, I'm sure that was probably a pretty familiar one. The phone calls coming from upstairs. And no, I'm ashamed to say that it is not very similar to our story, Murder on the Marsh. But, I mean, hey, you gotta plug yourself somehow. And also, I know that when I was younger, this one kind of seemed like it was a happy ending to me. But go back, and if you didn't realize how grisly this ending is, go back and read it like it's one of those fucking math problems from when you were a kid, like a subtraction problem. There's the hint for you. And use some context clues from some of the words used there at the end. Alright, well that's all I got to give you for today, creeps. Got some more treats coming for you soon. Until then, Doc out. What's going on, creeps? Back again for some more scary stories to tell in the dark. So, without further ado, let's just get right into the damn thing. First one's gonna be The Big Toe. One day, a boy was digging in his garden when he saw a big toe sticking out of the ground. He tried to pick it up, but it was stuck. It wouldn't budge, so he pulled as hard as he could, and it came off in his hand. Then he heard something groan and scamper away. The boy took the big toe into the kitchen and showed it to his mom.
"That's a nice piece of meat,"
she said.
"I'll put it in the soup and we'll have it for dinner."
That night, at the dinner table, the boy's father scooped the big toe out of the soup and chopped it up into 3 pieces. The father, the mother, and the boy each ate a piece. Then they did the dishes, and when it got dark, they went to bed. The boy fell asleep almost at once, but in the middle of the night he was rudely awakened by a strange sound. He listened closely. It sounded like there was a voice coming from outside his window, and it was calling to him.
"Where is my big toe?"
It groaned. When the boy heard that, he got very scared, but he thought, "It doesn't know where I am. It never will find me." Then he heard the voice once more, only now it was closer.
"Where is my big toe?"
It groaned. The boy pulled the blankets over his head and closed his eyes. "I'll go to sleep," he thought. "When I wake up, it will be gone." But soon he heard the back door open, and again he heard the voice.
"Where is my big toe?"
It groaned. Then the boy heard footsteps move through the kitchen, into the dining room, into the living room, into the front hall. They slowly climbed the stairs. Closer and closer they came. Soon they were in the upstairs hall. Now they were outside his door.
"Where is my toe?"
The voice groaned. The boy watched in horror as his bedroom door opened. Shaking with fear, he threw his bedclothes over his head and listened as the footsteps slowly moved through the dark towards his bed. Then they stopped.
"Where is my toe?"
The voice groaned.
"You've got it."
Next one is one entitled Harold. There was an old farmer in Arizona who owned the best farm in the area. Everybody said his crops were the best, and people came from all over to buy their goods from him. Whenever people asked him how he was able to grow such good quality crops, the old farmer would say, "It was all down to his scarecrow."
The old scarecrow is the one I have to thank,
said the farmer.
He makes sure no crows or critters or pests come near my crops.
The old farmer had built the scarecrow himself, and it was a fearsome sight. He spent months working on it to make it as scary as possible. He knew how important it was to keep pests away from his crops, so he gave it enormous straw arms that stretched out about 6 feet, and big, long legs that made it as tall as a tree. But the scariest thing about this scarecrow was its head. The farmer carved it himself out of a huge pumpkin. He spent countless days and nights perfecting its design until it was perfect. The scarecrow's face and head was so grotesque and ugly that even he was sometimes scared to look at it. But it was very effective, scaring away every rodent and bird that ventured near. The neighboring farm was owned by 2 young men who were brothers named Josh and Harold. They were lazy and never did much work around the farm, which resulted in their crops being bad. They were jealous of the old farmer's success and were plotting against him. If they could drive him out of business, they could take over his farm and make more money. So one night, the brothers decided to sneak onto the old farmer's land. They stole his prized scarecrow and brought it back to their own house, where they stuffed it into an old closet so nobody would ever find out. The next day, the farmer woke up to find his hideous scarecrow missing and all his croppings being eaten by rats and crows. He fell to his knees and cried, knowing that his farm would soon be out of business. Meanwhile, the brothers Josh and Harold were watching from their own property and couldn't help laughing out loud when they saw the old man's tears of grief. Hearing the laughter, the old farmer came over and asked them if they knew what happened to his scarecrow. The brothers looked him right in the eye and said they had no idea where his precious scarecrow might be.
"But you know I'll go out of business and have to sell my farm if I can't find my scarecrow,"
said the farmer. Josh just laughed in his face, saying, "That's just your tough luck, isn't it?"
"It sucks to be you,"
giggled Harold. The old farmer walked slowly back to his house, his head hanging down in defeat and depression. That night, as Josh and Harold had trouble sleeping, not because they felt any remorse, but because they couldn't get the image of the scarecrow's horrible, twisted face out of their minds. They decided they would never be able to sleep as long as that ugly pumpkin head was in their house. So they got up and dragged the scarecrow out of the closet. Harold took a baseball bat and smashed the scarecrow's head to pieces until all that was left was little bits of pumpkin strewn around the floor. The brothers swept up the pumpkin head pieces and threw them in the trash. Then they went back to bed and were soon fast asleep, having put all thoughts of the disgusting scarecrow face out of their heads. Sometime after midnight, Josh and Harold were awoken by the sounds of scratching and clawing at their bedroom door.
"Did you forget to put the dog out?"
asked Harold sleepily.
"Well, we don't have a dog,"
stammered Josh. Suddenly, the bedroom door burst open and a solitary long straw arm snaked in through the opening. Then, a second arm thrashing around, followed by 2 long stick legs. The 2 brothers were frozen in fear and could only look with horror as the headless scarecrow's body rose up on its long stick legs and its long arms reaching out for them in the darkness. Harold felt a cold, sinewy straw claw close around his ankle and screamed as loud as he could. He begged his brother Josh to help him, but Josh was already running out of the bedroom. Fleeing in terror, he ran down the hallway, crashed through the front door, and out into the moonlit road. He ran as fast as his legs could carry him, puffing and panting and screaming at the top of his voice. As he passed his neighbor's house, he saw the old farmer standing at his gate. In the moonlight, he could see the farmer just staring at him with a strange smile on his face. Josh kept running, his bare feet slapping against the rough gravel road. He glanced back over his shoulder and saw something that scared him to his very soul. He saw the scarecrow running along the road close behind him. It was gaining on him, closer and closer. And that wasn't all he saw. He noticed that the scarecrow had a brand new head, and it looked a lot like Harold. Alright, and this will be the last offering today. This one is entitled High Beams. As the woman drove down a deserted highway, she noticed a lone pair of headlights quickly approaching her car from behind. When the car came closer, she noticed that it was going to overtake her. The car drew up beside her, but then the driver suddenly swerved back behind the car. She started getting nervous and kept an eye on the strange car in her rearview mirror. He pulled up dangerously close to her rear bumper and began flashing his high beams at her. The headlights dimmed for a moment, but then the high beams flashed again and the car behind her surged forward. The car followed her very closely, and on tight curves or over hills he would flash his high beams on and off. The frightened woman struggled to keep her eyes on the road and fought the urge to keep looking at the car behind her. Finally, she approached her exit, but the car continued to follow, flashing the high beams again and again. The terrified woman took out her mobile phone and dialed 911. When the operator answered, the woman screamed into the phone.
A car is following me! He keeps tailgating and blinking his lights at me!
The woman gave her address, and in a few minutes she saw the red and blue lights of a police car in the distance. She breathed a sigh of relief as she pulled into the driveway, but suddenly, the strange car pulled into the driveway behind her and began blinking its lights on and off like a maniac. The police car screeched to a halt on the woman's front lawn, and 2 police officers jumped out with their guns drawn. They pulled the man out of the strange car and forced him to lie face down on the lawn. Then they handcuffed him as he screamed,
There's someone in the car! There's someone in the car!
The 2 policemen suddenly pointed their guns in the woman's direction and fired. The woman screamed. But when she turned around, she saw the bloody corpse of a murderer fall out of her back seat. There was a large butcher knife still clasped in his cold, dead hand. The police searched her back seat and found duct tape, a blindfold, and a pair of handcuffs lying there. The woman realized that the man in the strange car had been trying to save her. When the police released him, he explained that as he was pulling up behind her car and his headlights lit up her back seat, he had seen a man with a butcher knife rising up behind her, just as the madman was about to stab her. He flashed his high beams and the figure crouched back down.
I flashed my high beams every time I saw him raise the knife, he said.
Alright, well, that is all we really have to offer for you today. And, well, I'm sure we'll have a couple more for you. There's plenty to pick from, and we still got plenty more time this month. And just for a little closing statement, I just want y'all creeps to know,
I was that butcher knife wielding maniac.
till next time, creeps.